Hey, what's going on, everyone? GoodMicWork Commentaries back at you with a really fun retro Monday Night Raw review. This video is sponsored by Patreon supporter Brandon Collier, who has taken advantage of one of the tiers on the Patreon page where you can have a video done on any wrestling-related topic that you want. Now, this is similar to an idea that I was doing on the channel about a year or so ago, where I was offering PayPal donations and things like that, and I had so many people jumping at the chance to support that it was actually a little bit too much, and I had to back off from doing those for a while. But I have always left it as a hidden tier on Patreon, and I have also been updating the tiers on Patreon. So if you would like more information on how you can sponsor your own video and help support the channel, I've thrown the Patreon link at the very top of the description. A lot of those tiers and some of the details in there are going to be changing from time to time. That's why I'm not going to give you the full details here, but I have added a couple of additional options for video sponsoring down there, a cheaper version and a more expensive version. So you guys can check that out in the link below if you would like to support. If not, sit back and relax and enjoy a really fun review. I am thrilled that Brandon requested this particular show, and the reason he requested this is because he knows I was there, and he wanted to hear my specific memories and perspective of this show, which, to be honest, is really one of the most loaded Monday Night Raws in history in terms of a 2-hour show and how much stuff they had going on. We had 2 title matches. We had 2 surprise returns. We basically had a double turn to close the show. We had the beginning of the Vince McMahon Kiss My Ass Club. This show was all over the place, and it was a lot of fun. So I think Brandon picked a winner here, and this is going to be a really fun Raw to relive. Now, as Brandon is aware, I did attend this show because I was also at the Survivor Series the night before in Greensboro. I just did a review of that very show this past November on my channel. I'll throw a link to that video right up in the upper right of the screen there for you guys to check out. And I had amazing seats for that show. I was right directly in front of the hard cam. You can see me throughout the entire pay-per-view. Here's one shot of me here, and get a load of that 25-year-old with hair. Holy shit. I have a ton of fond memories of Survivor Series and that entire weekend because it really culminated the whole invasion angle and pretty much the demise and the official end of WCW. And it was kind of surreal to be right in the middle of that, considering how emotionally invested I was during the Monday Night Wars and how I was firmly behind the side of the WWE. And even though the invasion was a complete joke, there was still just something about it that made me fiercely loyal to the WWE. Now, one thing that's interesting about not only the Survivor Series the night before, but this particular Monday Night Raw, is that I have no personal photos of either one of these shows. Now, I used to go to a ton of shows in the Attitude Era, dating all the way back to 96 through 2001. I was at a shitload of shows, and most of those occasions I would pick up a disposable camera from a convenience store or something. That's really how you took pictures back in the day. I didn't really have the money at that time to have a nice professional camera, and of course there were no cell phones with cameras on them at that time. So the only photos I have from wrestling shows are really bad quality pictures taken from disposable cameras, and most of them came out like shit. And I can't remember the exact reason of why not only did I not take a camera to Survivor Series, but why I didn't take one to this Monday Night Raw as well. The only thing I could think of is I probably just didn't want to distract myself from the show by worrying about taking a picture that I knew was going to come out like shit, because by this point I had had hundreds of photos developed from film on these shitty cameras, and none of them came out well. So probably in my mind I was thinking, look, this is a big weekend, it's a pay-per-view, my seats are good, I want to watch the show, I want to enjoy the show, and I don't want to have to worry about anything else. That's likely the reason why I didn't take any photos here, but I honestly just don't remember. So Brandon, I apologize for not having any sort of exclusive images to share of this show, but I definitely have plenty of memories. Now, like I said, we are reviewing WWE Monday Night Raw the night after Survivor Series 2001. It went down on November 19th, 2001 from the Charlotte Coliseum in Charlotte, North Carolina. And whenever they would come around the Carolinas, they would hit up all the cities. They would hit Charlotte, they would hit Greensboro, they would hit Fayetteville, and in coming years, they would start hitting Raleigh as well, along with Richmond and Hampton and Norfolk and Columbia, South Carolina and Atlanta. They'd be all over the Southeast there, and we would always go to the North Carolina shows, and we'd drive all over the place. So I find myself heading to Raw after a really crazy Survivor Series the night before, and a couple of personal memories that I do have of the show that Brandon was asking about in his initial message is that I remember being in line going into the show and talking with some fans, and there was a lot of Ric Flair talk going on. We're going to talk about Flair's return at the end of the review here, but it really wasn't that enormous of a surprise because, WCW had already been bought out. There was always rumors of Ric Flair coming in at some point. They find themselves in Charlotte night after a pay-per-view. Perfect night for him to debut, and I think that the feeling was there. I think that that was the rumblings around the fans in Charlotte, is that we just felt it. We felt like it was going to happen. There was a lot of wooing, just like there always is in every wrestling line and in every wrestling arena, but this was pretty strong at this show. So that's one distinct memory I definitely have of entering the building in Charlotte that night. We open up with an old-school WWF logo montage with all the different ones they've done throughout the years, and then they transition into the End Is Here video package where they really highlighted the bitter feud between the Alliance and the WWF. And then they cut to an airport tarmac where they see WWE's private jet. And Mick Foley, who was the commissioner at that time, arrives. He boards the jet to talk to Vince McMahon, and I remember this. This was like Mick's actual departure from the company. I think they wrote him off TV after this. He was on the plane with Vince, and Vince seems kind of nonchalant about the whole thing, and Mick cuts a little bit of a heartfelt promo on Vince, saying that his actions and his behavior has made him hate professional wrestling and hate his job and ashamed to work for the WWF, and proceeds to resign before Vince can actually fire him. So he storms off the jet, and Vince, the entire time, is eating a plate of fruit, just kind of says, okay, see you later, Mick, like he doesn't give a shit at all. And I think that was it for Foley in the WWE for a while. We then go into the Raw intro. We get the pyro. We get Jim Ross welcoming everybody to Monday Night Raw, and the camera pans in on him to show him sitting next to an empty chair. Because if you remember at this time, Paul Heyman was doing commentary with Jim Ross ever since February when Jerry Lawler left after they fired Stacey Carter. So with Heyman being firmly behind the Alliance, he should be out of the job as per the stipulation of the Survivor Series main event. The losing team, everyone would be fired with the exception of the champions. So Jim Ross says he doesn't know who's going to be joining him in the commentary booth. And that's when Vince McMahon's music hits. He comes out to an enormous ovation, huge babyface ovation, struts down to the ring, proud as hell, says that tonight is a night for celebration. And he goes on to put over Kurt Angle, because if you remember the night before, Kurt Angle turned on the Alliance in the main event, rejoining WWE, basically saving the match for WWE. And Vince is extremely grateful to Kurt Angle. And this is kind of where you see the lines being a little bit crossed here. Now, Vince McMahon, even though he was still Vince, he was mostly the babyface throughout the invasion. Now that the invasion is over, I thought this was a really interesting way to slowly get Vince back to what he was prior to the invasion, at WrestleMania 17, when he was the heel in the match with Shane. And then they reversed all throughout the invasion. So Vince had a really interesting night here. So he's coming out there to a babyface reaction, yet he's putting over Kurt Angle and being overly grateful to Kurt Angle when the rest of the audience can clearly see that Angle was basically saving himself by coming in and turning on the Alliance. He would have gone with whoever the winner is, but Vince McMahon can't seem to see that. He also says that the WCW title will now be known as the World Championship. So they basically just made that change here as well. I thought they were going to get rid of the title, but they would wind up unifying it the next month right here in San Diego at Vengeance. So they've now stripped the championship of the name WCW. Vince also calls out Stone Cold Steve Austin, says he has a plan for Austin, and when Austin gets here, he will execute his plan. So we got to remember, Austin the previous night was a heel. It was down to him and The Rock, the last two in the ring, and The Rock beat him, winning the match for the WWE. And Vince apparently has something big planned for Stone Cold Steve Austin. He also goes on to say that tonight will be the beginning of the Vince McMahon Kiss My Ass Club. And I remember when he said that in the audience, a bunch of us were laughing in the section that I was in. I think everybody pretty much knew right away that he was dead serious, like literally serious, that somebody was going to kiss his ass. It wasn't even a figure of speech. I think that was understood almost immediately. But Vince makes that very clear to the audience, and he says that one member of the Alliance is going to get an employment opportunity. All they got to do is literally kiss his ass. And then after that, he's got some business to tie up. He actually calls out to the ring Paul Heyman. And I remember sitting in my seat, and incidentally, if you're wondering where my seats were, unfortunately, they were not as good as Survivor Series. Survivor Series, I had amazing seats. For this Monday Night Raw, I was on the first level, probably about 20 rows up behind the announce table. So not on the floor, but the first level a little bit up. So I actually had really good seats because I could see a full view of the Titantron and the set and everything, but I certainly wasn't anywhere near as close as I was for Survivor Series. And I remember sitting there when I saw Paul Heyman strutting down to the ring, and you could see on the Tron that he was wearing a WWF hat. And I'm like, oh, fuck. Because I, at that time, was paying very close attention to the behind-the-scenes story of the Jerry Lawler and WWF situation. I have no idea why, but that entire situation fascinated me. I even mentioned in my wrestling collection video that I released on my 10th anniversary, I talked about the wrestling books that I had. And WWE did a bunch of shitty books in the Attitude Era, trying to capitalize on the success, I think, of Mick Foley's book and how great that was. And I really didn't care about any of their books except for one, and that was Jerry the King Lawler, because he told the entire story of what happened, and for some reason I was just so fascinated by it. I remember hearing the news when he left, being in disbelief. I'm like, holy shit, Lawler is not in the WWE? That blows my mind. I remember talk of him showing up on Nitro, because it was like a month before WCW was bought out. There was talk of Lawler actually appearing on Nitro. But as time went by, you started hearing rumors that things weren't going well with Stacey Carter, and we pretty much knew as fans that the minute that relationship was over, Lawler was probably heading back to the WWF. And I was ready for him to come back to the WWF. At that time, I loved Lawler. Here in 2020, not so much. I think he's got no business being on Monday Night Raw. But during this time, he was the voice. Him and Jim Ross together, they were Monday Night Raw. So I was chomping at the bit for Lawler to come back, and from what I understood in the dirt sheets and in the rumor mill and on the hotlines, I was hearing that we could see Lawler back at any time. So when I see Paul Heyman coming out there bebopping down to the ring with that WWF hat, I'm like, oh, fuck me. They're going to keep him on commentary, and they're just going to make some stupid reason for him to convince Vince to let him stay on commentary. And I thought that kind of sucked. Even though Paul Heyman's great on commentary, it's not the outcome that I wanted. So unfortunately, I can't hear what Jim Ross is saying. I just see Paul Heyman walking over to the announce desk, and he puts on the headset. So I'm thinking that he's just going to sit down right there, and then Vince McMahon calls him into the ring. And I'm like, oh, okay, maybe we have a chance here. Or maybe he's just going to make Paul Heyman do something or humiliate him in order to keep his job at the announce booth. At this point, I was convinced in my head that we weren't going to see Jerry Lawler. So on the TV version of this, of course, prior to Heyman getting in the ring, he's on headset telling Jim Ross and bragging to Jim Ross that he got away with it. I got away with it. I got away with it. And laughing in Jim Ross's face. And that's when Vince McMahon calls Paul Heyman into the ring. So Heyman gets into the ring. Vince McMahon talks shit to him a little bit and then fires him. Paul Heyman gets pissed, and this was hilarious. He pulls off his jacket. He's ready to fight Vince, and Vince is like, okay. Vince takes off his jacket, and Paul Heyman immediately runs away. Vince would have whooped his ass. That was pretty funny. So instead of attacking Vince, Heyman decides to jump the announce table and attack Jim Ross. And Jim Ross gets a hold of him and starts just laying blows into the back of Paul Heyman. It was amazing. He had security showing up there to pry Paul Heyman away from Jim Ross, and they are literally dragging him away when Vince McMahon gets on the microphone and says, let me introduce everyone to Paul Heyman's replacement, Jerry the King Lawler. And I lost my shit. They got me. I was convinced as a fan sitting in the arena that night that it wasn't going to be Jerry Lawler. And then Vince at the very last minute snuck it in. Lawler comes out through Gorilla just as they're carrying Paul Heyman away, kind of points at him and laughs. And the two of those guys go way back, don't forget. Way back. They've had several issues. And the last time that they saw each other was probably just a couple of years before that, in 97, when ECW had that brief working agreement with WWE, and Lawler went over there to work a pay-per-view or two. So I thought that was really well done, how they carried one away while the new one comes out. And I was so relieved. I felt like Raw wasn't the same. And it was so amazing how Lawler, he left literally right before the WCW buyout, and he came back the very next night after the invasion angle was over. So Lawler is another guy, along with Chris Benoit and along with Triple H, that I think would have been really key components to that angle. They would have offered a lot. And I think it would have been interesting to see where Triple H and Chris Benoit would have sided in the alliance. I think we know where Lawler would be. But he's another one of those guys, along with a long list of WCW talent who are all sitting out their contracts, that would have been extremely useful in the invasion angle. I think Lawler has kind of a sleeper pick there, being a person that I think would have added a lot to the entire angle. Lawler shows up to the announce booth to an absolutely overjoyed Jim Ross, who is so happy to have Lawler back. Lawler says he's back, and they're going to be getting back to the way things used to be, and that was really awesome to see. I got to say, man, I'm marked out for that. That was a big segment. That was a big moment in WWE history. The first match of the night is a WWF Women's title match. Trish, who just won the belt the previous night, defending the title against Lita. Now, there had been a little bit of tension here with the Hardys and Lita. They teased something the night before, showing Matt coming out of Trish's locker room. Now, Matt kind of gets involved. He's on the outside of the ring. Him and Lita actually run into each other, I believe, at one point, both getting hit in the mouth. And he's trying to help Lita up on the outside of the ring and winds up tossing her back into the ring, only for Trish to immediately grab her and pin her with a backslide. You don't see too many matches ending in a backslide. So there seemed to be a little bit of confusion there, and Lawler and Ross were alluding to the fact that Matt might have thrown Lita in there too early. And not too long after this, I think, is when they tried to do one of the first Hardy Boys splits, which, if I remember right, didn't work out too well. They cut backstage to show tonight's main star, Vince McMahon. He's all over the show. He approaches the remaining Alliance members in the locker room, all the champs. Rob Van Dam, who is the hardcore champion. Christian, who is the European champion. The Dudley Boys are the tag team champions. And Test won the Immunity Battle Royal, despite losing, I believe, the Intercontinental title to Edge the night before. So Vince is basically there to make all of their lives miserable. He tells RVD that he's going to get in the ring and fight his friends, the Dudley Boys, in a handicap tables match. And that match is next. So they have to run off and have their match. Christian attempts to suck up to Vince McMahon and says, "Look, I'm really happy to be working with you again," and extends his hand for a handshake. And Vince says, "Get out of my sight." And Christian just kind of scurries away. So we go back out to the ring now. We've got the tag team handicap tables match. Dudley Boys taking on Rob Van Dam. This is kind of a weird match, especially at the end. Rob Van Dam crashes and burns hard on a frog splash. Devon is laying on one of the tables about 3/4 of the way across the ring. Van Dam hops up on the top rope, dives off for the frog splash. Devon moves, but Van Dam doesn't go through the table, but his face basically hits the edge of it and just takes a disgusting bump, which allows the Dudleys to pick up Rob Van Dam and 3D him through the other table, but the table didn't even break, so they have to pick him up and do it again. So kind of like two botches there. I don't think Rob Van Dam meant to catch that table on the frog splash miss the way he did, and they certainly didn't mean for the table not to break on the first 3D attempt. So kind of a wonky finish there, but it really didn't mean anything. It was just basically another chapter in Vince's revenge warpath. We then cut to the parking lot area and parking garage where we see Kurt Angle arriving on the scene, and he's got a big-ass, shit-eating, milk-drinking grin on his face. He walks in extremely proud. Walks up to some production guy and says, "Do you know where The Rock is?" And I think even demands a thank you for Kurt Angle saving the WWF. And the guy gives Kurt directions to go find The Rock. We then cut to Times Square in New York, where we have Linda McMahon hanging out at WWF New York, walking around shaking hands of all the greasy-fingered wrestling fans. That was pretty funny. We then cut to The Rock's locker room, and Angle shows up, and he would do what he does to everyone on this show, demand a thank you for saving the WWE. Rock basically says, "Go fuck yourself, I'm not stupid," tells Kurt that he's full of shit, and he knows the only reason he came back to the WWF is because he knew it was over for the Alliance, and he was basically just covering his ass. Rock would then go on to propose a match, and Kurt would go on to say, "Fine, but how about we make it for your world championship?" So now we've got a Rock versus Kurt Angle title match on this show. And I got to be honest, I haven't gone back and looked at this show in many years, and I forgot this match even happened. I completely forgot that I watched Rock and Kurt Angle wrestle for the world title in person. It's a match I hardly ever think about. We then cut to the back of the arena again, and we see a rental car pulling up. And Stephanie and Shane jump out, which is hilarious because prior to this, they were arriving in limousines. Stephanie is immediately bitching about having to drive. "I can't believe we have to drive, and why do you think Dad wants us here?" So Vince has summoned his two loser children from the night before to Monday Night Raw for some reason, and they start heading to the ring. I think we go to a commercial, we come back, Vince is in the ring again, and he calls out Shane and Stephanie. Now, this is kind of a tale of two siblings here because Shane takes it like a man. He says, "Vince, you are the better man. You won," and leaves, and that's it. So no humiliation. Shane doesn't get beat up, doesn't get shit on, nothing like that. He just takes his lumps and leaves. Stephanie, on the other hand, loses her shit. She starts in with the daddy stuff. Oh, daddy, please forgive me, and blames Shane for everything. She says he made her do it. It was all Shane's idea. Everything that went wrong was 100% Shane's fault and 0% her fault. And Vince indulges her for literally what felt like 5 straight minutes of her just being an annoying twat. And Vince lets her go through all of that, only to say F you and instructs security to come down to the ring and pry her off of Vince's leg, which she is now grabbing onto. So she's drug away, kicking and screaming. That's great stuff. Later on, Vince is then shown backstage on the phone, and he's approached by Chris Jericho. Vince called Chris Jericho into his office because the night before, in the Survivor Series main event, Jericho, who was on Team WWF, also has a ton of beef with The Rock. And that boiled over near the end of the match, and Jericho turned on The Rock, and if memory serves, I think he even hit him with a skull-crushing finale in that match. I might be wrong about that. And that nearly cost WWE the match against the Alliance, and Vince is pissed. Vince scolds Jericho for doing what he did, and Jericho apologizes, and he shows remorse, and Vince then books Jericho in a match later on with Kane. We then cut to ringside, and they show something that I completely forgot about. I completely forgot that Mr. T was on this show. He's in the front row there wearing a 1-800-COLLECT shirt. Remember those commercials? Holy crap. And that had been completely deleted from my memory until I saw it. We then got the world title match between The Rock and Kurt Angle. This was an interesting match, and I really liked the finish. The Rock won by basically countering the ankle lock into a victory roll, something that I don't think I've ever really seen before. And it was really interesting how The Rock actually out-wrestled Kurt Angle to get the victory there. Angle is pissed, feels like he got caught off guard. He goes on to attack The Rock. The Rock fights back. Jericho shows up, and Jericho and Angle together beat down The Rock. Jericho puts Rock in the walls of Jericho, and their issue continues. It's Kiss My Ass time. We've got Vince back in the ring again for his 24th segment of the night. And at this time, we're all wondering what former Alliance star is going to get this opportunity, because he already fired Paul Heyman. So when he called out William Regal, I was like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because Regal was being a son of a bitch, especially to Vince during all the invasion stuff. So Vince gets William Regal to come out there, and Regal is just so amazing. He has never not been fabulous. He was so funny during this time, coming out there in the suit and his wonderful facial expressions. I'll never forget when Jericho pissed in his tea. like how awesome that was. Regal is so expressive, and he's so hilarious, and he is literally one of my favorite people that has ever existed in the pro wrestling business. Absolute gold. So he comes out there, and he's listening to Vince, and he's assuming that when Vince says it's a Kiss My Ass Club, it just means that he has to grovel or humiliate himself. And that's when Vince informs him that, no, this club is exactly what it sounds like. You have to kiss my ass. And to see just the pure and utter disgust on the face of Regal is priceless in all of this. So Regal is almost in disbelief. Surely you don't mean I'm going to kiss your bottom right here on TV. And Vince is like, that's exactly what I fucking mean. So then Vince proceeds to loosen his belt and pull down his pants, which he's wearing underwear. So Regal's like, oh shit. So he makes Regal get down on his knees and says, oh no, we're not done yet. And then he pulls down his underwear. Now, do you know where the timekeeper sits? I'm like kind of in that corner, but up on the first level. So I'm kind of peering diagonally into the ring. So I can see the side of Vince's ass, but I can't tell if he's bare-assed under there or he's got a thong or what. So once Vince's big white ass is exposed and Regal is in position, Vince pulls out some chapstick out of his pocket and says, nobody's going to kiss my ass with chapped lips. So when he makes Regal put on the chapstick, Vince's own chapstick, Regal's got to put it on. And then Vince does the thing where he says, look, I can even make my ass do tricks. And he jiggles his fucking ass cheeks. Poor Regal is about to lose his poor mind here. And after a lot of teasing and a lot of hesitation, Regal gets closer and closer. I remember in this sea of Crazy Attitude Era fans around me, and we were eating this shit up. So finally, when you see Regal's lips come down and make contact to Vince's ass, you would have thought Stone Cold Steve Austin won the WWE title. It was the pop of the century. There were so many big pops on this show, from Lawler to Regal to Flair. Oh my God. This was a super hot crowd and a super fun night. And I will never forget getting a huge kick out of that. Now, I think this segment definitely had its critics. A lot of people were like, what the fuck, Vince? But He had done crazier shit than this earlier on in the year when he drugged his wife and was making out with Trish. So by this point, I had kind of gotten used to these crazy antics from Vince, and one of the better segments, one of the more interesting segments that I've attended live. Can you believe that not only was I in attendance for the very first Kiss My Ass segment, I was also in attendance for the very first This Is Your Life segment. I have seen some weird shit live in the Carolinas, that's for sure. So after the commercial break, I think you see Regal coming back through the curtain. He's confronted by Tazz, who gives him shit and laughs in his face, and then Regal flies into a rage and attacks and beats the shit out of Tazz, which would lead to a match later on in the night. Up next, we get the Jericho and Kane match that Vince made earlier on. Jericho winds up getting DQ'd. He brings a chair into the ring. Kane hops up on the top rope and is about to hit one of those awesome top rope clotheslines, but Jericho swings the chair like a baseball bat, takes out Kane, and the referee, I believe for this was Teddy Long. He calls for the bell, and Jericho continues the attack on Kane as well, putting him in the walls of Jericho until more refs come out to stop that. We cut backstage to a very angry Kurt Angle. He's walking through the corridors there, and he's all pissed, and he comes across Edge. And he takes that opportunity to go over to Edge and demand a thank you from him. And Edge is like, fuck you, dude. I got 2 titles. I've got 2 titles. 2 more than you have. I saved my own job. I didn't need you to help me, and goes on to call out Kurt for playing both sides and says that nobody's stupid. We all know what you were doing. You may have Vince McMahon snowed, but you don't have any of us snowed. We then go out to the ring where we have the Regal versus Tazz match. Regal comes storming out there, still in his basically his business clothes, but without the sports coat. And what was interesting about this match is we had a ton of smoke from Tazz's pyro. Now, this is another little detail of the Attitude Era that I remember vividly. Back in these days when they would do the insane pyro, when they opened up Raw, you would always get a ton of smoke in the arena, and some shows on certain Raws and certain pay-per-views, it would really fill up the ring for like the first match. I think another good example of that would be, I think, SummerSlam 2002. It was Mysterio and Angle, and I think that match started really in a fog. And back in the day, I remember you could hear, I guess they would turn on fans or something like that to help vent out and filter out a lot of the smoke. So whenever this would happen, if you listen real close on TV, you can almost hear like a buzzing, and you would hear that in the audience sometimes too. But for some reason, Tazz's pyro caused way more smoke than the opening pyro, which is really surprising. But Regal just beats the shit out of Tazz, really taking out his frustrations on him. We cut backstage again to see Kurt Angle. This is such a priceless shot of him sulking, chin in the fist. Aw, poor Kurt Angle. He's sitting there all bent out of shape, and Vince McMahon approaches him, and he's got the WWF Championship belt over his shoulder. And he asks Kurt Angle if he wants to be WWF champion. You want to be WWF champion? And Kurt's like, hell yeah, I do. And Vince is like, all right, come out to the ring with me and let's do this right now. So this is our main event segment, Kurt Angle and Vince McMahon making their way to the ring. Vince has got the WWF championship. Austin has not shown up to the arena, so Vince is coming out to the ring to actually award the WWF championship and hand it to Kurt Angle. So Vince is building up his speech, putting over Kurt. Kurt is doing the thing where he's crying and he's so emotional and he's so happy and so proud. And right before Vince is about to hand it to him, that's when we hear the music of the Nature Boy. And we were waiting for that. All night long in the arena, the fans were chanting for Ric Flair. It was brewing. We could all feel it. We all knew it. 3 years ago, back in 1998, I was in Greensboro for Unforgiven, and there was a lot of Ric Flair chants that night. There's even talk that Ric Flair was in the area, ready to show up at the event if he was able to. And I remember the fans wanted him then, 3 years ago. Now, fast forward, WCW's out of business. The invasion angle is over. They're in Charlotte. Come on, man, we got to see Ric Flair. So when his music started playing, the crowd lost it. Ric Flair coming back to the WWF, first time in nearly 9 years. He had left in early 93 and stayed in WCW until they closed down. So it was a long time since Ric Flair was in the WWF. So that was very cool for me to be there in person to see him return to the company. Lawler and Flair, 2 icons of non-WWE wrestling, both making their returns to the WWF in the same night, I thought was really cool. Now, I wasn't expecting them to go in the storyline direction that they did. When Flair was coming out to the ring, I just thought he was going to announce that he was in the company now. And they kind of threw a curveball at us here, when Flair gets on the mic and starts talking to Vince about Shane and Stephanie selling their stock to a consortium. And that's when, after a little bit of dancing, a little bit of wooing, and a little bit of Ric Flairing, the Nature Boy informs Vince McMahon that when Shane and Stephanie sold their stock to that consortium, that the consortium was him, and now Flair and Vince are partners. And that's when Vince does the classic ear thing, when he starts grabbing the ear. There is no more iconic Vince moment than that. I mean, he's got a few of them. The thing where he tips himself over in the chair is pretty cool. When he raises from the ring apron at WrestleMania 19 with blood pouring down his face. Vince has had some moments, but this is one of my absolute favorites. I don't know what he was thinking or why he did that, but it fucking worked. It literally looked like he went full schizo in a matter of moments there, grabbing his ear like that. Great shit. So Vince is in full-on disbelief right after months of feuding with Shane and Stephanie and working so hard to eliminate them. He's right back to where they started, with someone else now controlling his company. And that's when Stone Cold Steve Austin's music hits. I actually kind of liked this theme a little bit. WWE, if you remember, could not figure out what to do with Austin as a heel. Once he turned heel at WrestleMania 17, they had him keep his Disturbed theme song for a little while, but I think they realized it was a little too babyface-ish, and they basically took his older theme song prior to the Disturbed one and slowed it down. And then that was his heel theme for a while. But then they scrapped that and went to this theme that was a little bit more fast-paced but did not resemble his previous theme at all. But I kind of grew to like it in terms of a heel Stone Cold Steve Austin. So he now is coming to the ring after being a chicken shit heel for the past several months, dating all the way back to WrestleMania 17. He's now coming out to the ring to a pretty big pop from the crowd. He hits the ring, he attacks Kurt Angle, beats the shit out of him, beats the shit out of Vince McMahon. Vince and Kurt Angle now retreat up the ramp. Ric Flair has now picked up the WWF title. He's got it over his shoulder. Austin stares at Ric Flair, and this was really cool. You know, these two guys had not seen each other probably in about 6 or 7 years, dating back to 94 or 95 in WCW when Austin was there last. And they go back even further than that with the Flair for the Old segments with Brian Pillman back in the day in WCW. So this was really cool to see them back in the same ring after all these years. And holy shit, have things changed dramatically for Stone Cold Steve Austin at that point. They have a little stare down. Austin approaches him, looking at the belt that's over Ric Flair's shoulder, and he grabs it, and Flair allows him to take it. Takes the belt off of him, puts it on his own shoulder, and proceeds to go get some beer, hands a beer to Ric Flair, and the two icons, one of the greatest of all time from yesterday and the greatest wrestler of today, share a beer together. The crowd is going nuts, and just like that, with a snap of a finger, Austin is now a babyface again, and Vince McMahon is back to being that dirty Vince McMahon heel. And it's not really, people don't really acknowledge this as a double turn, but it kind of is. Looking back, this was loaded, man. You had the culmination of the invasion angle the night before. You had Paul Heyman fired in the middle of the ring. You had Jerry Lawler returning to the company. You had the 2 title matches on this show. You had the birth of the Vince McMahon Kiss My Ass Club. You had Ric Flair coming back to the WWF after nearly 8 years, and you had Austin turning babyface and Vince turning heel all throughout the course of one 2-hour show. It amazes me how well WWE could utilize their time back in the day. Now in present day times, we get 3 hours of Monday Night Raw, and it's all miserable. This show was so loaded and so packed, and Brandon, I can't thank you enough for suggesting this one. It's been a long time since I went back and looked at this show that I attended. I wish I had a few more personal memories to share with you, but I went to so many shows back then, and I was probably really tired as well from attending Survivor Series the night before, so I really wish I had some more personal memories of this show. But aside from waiting in line to get into the building, a lot of fans talking about Ric Flair. I remember the reaction from the fans around me during the Kiss My Ass segment. All of that was great, and I remember my seat and the vantage point I had to the ring. But other than that, just being involved and being in the middle of a really hot crowd in the peak of the Attitude Era was a lot of fun. These shows and the crowds that would attend them were so hot and so fun, and it was just a completely different time. No cell phones to stare at, no distractions, just a sea of poster board, wrestling signs, and the occasional replica championship belt. There was nothing at all like attending a WWF show during this time in history. It was so amazing. So anyway, thank you very much for taking another really fun trip down memory lane. If you guys have anything to add about this show, or if you have any memories of it, feel free to leave it below. Hopefully, I will do many more of these in the future, and I really hope you enjoyed this retro review. You guys take care. I will talk to you real soon. Until next time, peace.